As part of the upcoming season of Victoria 3, we're getting a DLC centered on the Balkans called National Awakening. Obviously, this is very exciting for many reasons, and I can already imagine the various ways that the Balkans could turn out in a version of the game with more content for this relatively ignored region in the current game. That all being said, you can still do quite a bit with the Balkans even in the current patch of Vic 3, especially if you're a little creative. Today I'll be playing as Austria with the mission to pacify the Balkans, but not through force. Okay, maybe with a little force, but more so with the power of a united population. When the people come together, united by something, they can finally prosper, and that's the idea behind the power of an Austria motivated by a proper Catholic Crusade style mission. Now, in terms of what this will mean for the purpose of the game mechanics, we can stack a lot of modifiers that increase the wage for pops of our religion, and on account of that, we can create a stratified society with very rich Catholics and only kind of rich non-Catholics. It's pretty hard to honestly create a true underclass in Victoria 3, but I'll be trying my best. Sadly, making an ultra-rich Catholic population does not motivate people to convert, so our conversion speed will remain at its relatively sluggish pace no matter how much we elevate our Catholic pops. And in fact, by demoting the non-Catholic pops, we're going to make them convert slower because more of them will be radical. Regardless, the purpose behind this run is to mess with conversion and religious mechanics in Victoria 3, what little of them there are, and just learn what we can from it. These are the grand ambitions of the game, but like any game of Victoria 3, it begins with the humble economy building phase. Let's put Austria on top of the world and let the world prosper because of it. In the past few centuries, the Balkans have been split between Austria and the Ottomans, two bitter rivals. The balance of power lately has resulted in significant Ottoman concessions thanks mostly to continued Russian interest in the protection of the Orthodox Christians under Turkish rule. Rather than allow the Russians to gain influence there, it's time for the Austrians to step up as the lords of the Balkans. But before taking on that role, Austria must strengthen herself. Industrialization, under the leadership of the Holy Church, must grip Austria and carry her to the forefront of European politics. The Metternich system is outdated and based on compromise. No compromise can be allowed. The League of the Golden Fleece is a new power block centered on Catholic identity. On a rock stands Michelangelo's David with three critical symbols: the wings of an angel, which is the Catholic nature of this coalition, the hammer of industrialization, which will give the means to achieve a Catholic world, and finally, a Roman helmet, in memory of the once united Church under Roman authority. With industry at the heart of this block, it was an obvious choice to take divine economics, which will eventually see the clergy take a more active role in the economic investment of the nation. In terms of the gameplay implications of this, you may have seen the thumbnail featuring over 70% religious folk clout. That is not an exaggeration. Eventually, once ownership of our buildings is mostly in the hands of the religious folk, we will indeed have a church in charge of everything. And the benefit of this is the very powerful Catholic intergroup trait, be fruitful and multiply, which gives extra birth rate. Right now, we have an overabundance of peasants, so birth rate isn't that necessary, but later on we'll need every pop we can get, so birth rate is great to have. The center of industrialization for Austria will be central Hungary, which is for two reasons. First of all, the Danube River gives a bonus to market access price impact, which is critically important for a place with important resources, which is the second reason. Central Hungary has coal, lumber, and iron, all in one spot, with almost 500,000 peasants worth of labor just waiting for jobs. We can make steel here, we can make tools here, and we can make engines here, all using local price advantages to keep profits high. Remember, goods purchased in the same state do not suffer from a market access price impact penalty, so no money is being wasted on nebulous logistics costs. In March of 1837, the overly restrictive import tariffs on grain in the Austrian market led to the rise of laissez-faire market liberal politics, spearheaded by the modern-minded conservative Heinrich Helbing. Meanwhile, the religious conservative faction of the government mostly tolerated these liberals, as they were more focused on, shall we say, encouraging Catholicism in the empire. Particularly, they were interested in ending the religious pluralism of Prague, with massive state-sponsored pogroms creating a bit of a backlash against the government from the academic urbanites of the empire. In news outside the empire, the fate of the lowlands has come into question, as the London Conference convenes to determine their fate. Austria, being a German power, favors the 24 points, which intends to compensate the Germans with the release of Limburg as a member of the German Confederation. Whether the treaty actually goes that way or not is irrelevant. It's more about making the Protestant North Germans understand that the Catholic Austria is on their side. More importantly to the fate of the empire, the industrial effort in central Hungary is going very well, with the government-run iron mines creating immense profits selling their product to the government itself for further construction. Shortly after, in July, a new ordinance, signed by the Archduke himself, has outlawed both heresy and heathenry, with a focus on the state's power to persecute its citizens for professing any anti-Catholic sentiment, let alone professing a different faith. With one wing of the Conservative Party satisfied, next was the path to a reformed market system, as Heinrich from earlier has taken the reins of the party. While the legislature is focused in on that, the rest of the nation began its crusade against the Ottoman menace, which has for too long ruled over the Christians of the Balkans with impunity. In this war, Austria intends to liberate Bulgaria and Albania, and personally conquer both Bosnia and Moldavia, which it views as part of its empire. Using help from Russia, the Ottomans will stand no chance. Within just a few months, the army marched to Constantinople, and under the pressure of combined Austrian and Russian occupation, the Turks surrendered in February of 1840. Their influence in the Balkans has been severely hampered with the loss of Bulgaria and Albania, and yet their hubris led them to attack Egypt in the summer of the same year. Regardless, the Austrians have little interest in the infighting of the Muslim world. Instead, the Italian principalities that were let go with the end of the Metternich system were slowly convinced to join the League of the Golden Fleece, including, of course, the Pope, who was all too happy to see a revival of Christian interest in politics. As well as Italy, the newly liberated nations of the Balkans came to the forefront of Austrian diplomatic interest, particularly Bulgaria, which is the most powerful of the newly liberated Balkan states. After all, part of the privileges granted to Austria as the leader of the Golden Fleece League is that any junior member can have their state religion changed over to Catholicism, and given the Bulgarians are Orthodox, their conversion to Catholicism is critical for Balkan unity. To talk a little bit about game mechanics here, the strategy to fully convert the Balkans will really only work by using the power block conversion mechanic, and that's because conversion in a state can only happen when there is at least one pop of the converting religion in the state. There are no Catholics in most of the Balkans, so we have two choices. We either get at least one person to migrate to the Balkans, which is of course completely impossible, or we use the fact that enforcing religion on someone via the power block action actually converts a small portion of their population in every single state to the new religion. Later on, when I enforce religion on Bulgaria, we will immediately get at least one Catholic pop in all their states, and then it's just a matter of time until at least a majority of the pops there are Catholic. In order to, perhaps, show some of the lower people that the high-minded ideals of a Catholic Austria will in fact not leave them behind, the Austrian government got to work passing public health care. If you're wondering why I'm not doing charity hospitals, it's because it sucks as a law, and we won't be needing the extra religious clout as we'll have that in abundance in the near future. So yeah, public healthcare is a gameplay compromise. It's hard to not take it when the other healthcare options are so terrible. That healthcare law passed in January of 1842, and if it wasn't obvious, I'm taking this video's pace pretty slowly, but we're hitting the point now where there's not so much happening. In the first 6 years of the game, we reformed Austria's economy and its identity as a religiously motivated crusader kingdom, in a way. With these law changes in effect, we can begin the true ascension of this empire. It's undeniable that the Christian world, at least in theory, should be centered on peace and love. And as the de facto leader of the Catholic world, at least in Europe, Austria is, of course, dedicated to the maintenance of peace. Well, that is to say, in the truest terms, the maintenance of peace. Peace must be maintained, and part of that is to preemptively destroy those that would disturb the peace. Would a small nation like Montenegro disturb the peace? Probably not, but no one actually noticed when they were conquered because their presence on the map was too small. Don't worry, Montenegro never existed. We're still a peaceful empire. The real target for the Austrian movement into the Balkans is of course the Ottomans. The goal is to take over what remains of Montenegro and to wrestle control over the wayward Orthodox Christians in the region. Unfortunately for the bloodthirsty, or rather peace-loving, Austrians, the Ottomans backed down and allowed Montenegro to slip from their grasp. This does isolate Serbia and Wallachia from their Ottoman market, meaning those nations will surely desire freedom in the future, but their freedom will have to wait out a truce. Around the same time, in July of 1845, Austria formally ended the right for women to hold property, as the church used its immense influence to implement society-molding bills that they felt would help the Austrian people maintain proper Christian values. Legal guardianship is honestly not a bad law since it gives you birthright, so getting it early on is nice, at which point you can later swap to women's suffrage for the higher workforce ratio, although we of course will not be doing that as our religious Austria here. Industrially speaking, the capitalists of central Hungary have been hard at work raking in profits for their iron mines, and through the wages they're paying out to the local Hungarians, they've been able to mend relations to some extent between the Hungarians and Austrians. More powerful than any motivation, economic opportunity has driven the Hungarians to an acceptance of Austrian overlordship, and as such, the whole question of an imperial partition between Austria and Hungary has mostly subsided. The Ungarnfrage will always loom in the background of Austrian politics nonetheless, though. As an attempt to further incorporate Hungarian identity into Austria, I was looking at the Mavag company, which is a central Hungarian company that uses tools and engines while also giving a throughput bonus to railways. That's honestly not a bad company. All I need is some engines in central Hungary, so I'll go for that. Despite Austria's obvious reputation for peace by this point, it would be the belligerent Prussians in search of dominance over the German Confederation that would drag the beast out of hiding. Peace-loving does not mean weak, and in response to Prussian aggression, Austria would show great clemency, asking only that Prussia abandon her misled ambitions to unite the Germans and to pay the cost of war, a humiliating proposition for them. As part of the defense of the empire, Russia, the Papal States, and Bavaria joined the war, as the Russians were happy to see the Germans remain disunited, and the Pope would fight tooth and nail to defend the righteous Catholic Empire. The Bavarians just wanted out of Prussia's sphere of influence in light of their aggressive ambitions. The war properly broke out in August of 1848 with two major fronts in the combined Russo-Austrian front at Silesia and Poland, and the Hanover front. The brunt of both sides of the war had their battalions in Poland and Silesia, while token forces fought it out in Hanover. While the Hanover front was quite heavily in Prussia's favor, the main front in Silesia was decidedly dominated by Austria and Russia, although Austria sought a quick end to the war given the financial burden of the fighting. With Berlin under threat as early as May of 1849, Prussia's will to fight was quickly draining. In an embarrassing defeat, the Prussians accepted Austrian victory the next month, acceding to every demand, none of which were particularly damning, but one of which would relegate Prussia to the position of number 2 among the German states for good. With Austria taking charge as the leader of all Germans, there's an opportunity to unite the disparate states into one great nation. However, the massive Protestant population of North Germany just isn't particularly attractive to the League of the Golden Fleece. While Austria isn't necessarily swearing off its role as a German leader, it is only accepting it half-heartedly, with a clear bias towards South Germany and its loyal Catholic populace. Victory against the Prussians did bolster the Austrians, who never felt more powerful, even if their victory was heavily owed to the Russians. Regardless, their newfound confidence led the Austrian religious interest group to make demands that the Balkan nations submit to Catholic influence. In September of 1849, the Bulgarian government was issued an ultimatum: accept papal authority or be destroyed, and of course the Bulgarians did submit to the vicar's will. Of critical importance is the fact that by doing this, a small minority of Catholics has been planted in Bulgaria, and in so doing, will that minority eventually grow to a majority, although it may take a very long time. In order to help encourage the growth of Catholic communities across the Balkans, Austria implemented new government incentives for destitute Catholics to find opportunities along the Danube. The freedom of movement principle will help get Catholic pops moving into states without an already present Catholic minority, to help lay the ground for an eventual conversion effort. Not all of the Balkan nations are willing to accept Austrian hegemony though, as they held out their loyalty to the Ottomans for whatever reason. As a result of that, war with the Turks would break out again in August of 1850. The goal of this war is to claim overlordship of Serbia and Wallachia. With this war, assuming it succeeds, the Ottomans would have very little land left in the Balkans aside from Constantinople itself and the isolated vilayet of southern Serbia, which will probably seek separation and union with the Karađorđević dynasty of Serbia proper. The war began in January the following year, and even without Russian support, the Ottomans were weak enough by now that their defense was a joke. After just 1 year, the Ottomans surrendered, losing all semblance of control over the Balkans and putting Austria firmly in command. It will take time to convince the Serbs and Vlachs of the uniquely benevolent nature of the Austrian overlordship, but in the meantime, the Austrian aristocracy passed the free trade law, which formally ended the Corn Laws and saw huge waves of prosperity come to the empire through the newly sparked trade of important goods across different markets. By this point, by the way, the aristocracy has mostly been left to the wayside, with the Catholic Church truly running the nation, and the Church has a new regime in mind. It's time to rescind the immense rights of the aristocrats and instead implement a technocracy composed of skilled engineers and clerks who, assuming they are proper Christians, can guide the empire towards prosperity. While figuring that law out, the rise in locomotives across Austria has given Mavag the opportunity to come to fruition, with the company formally establishing itself in August of 1852. Thanks to the absolutely dominant position of the Church, the technocracy law passed with relative ease, going through only a handful of debate rounds before its implementation. In August of 1854, the Austrian technocracy came to be with the Church at the top. Who says the religious upper classes have to be backwards buffoons after all? That being said, the government deficit is beginning to get worrying, and the enlightened rule that the church has advertised is starting to feel, perhaps, misleading. Regardless, the priority of the government is to take a stronger grip over the Balkans, and so war would soon break out with the Vlachs to reduce their autonomy. Despite their distance from the conflict, the Prussians decided they'd take up the mantle of Wallachian autonomy, supporting the tiny Balkan state in her fight for freedom. The Bulgarians also would join against Austria, although this is a good thing. If anything, it gives a good reason for Austria to demand a Bulgarian submission politically, in addition to their religious submission from earlier. Seeing this war escalating, the Wallachians chose instead to back down in this conflict, accepting Austrian dominance in order to save the many lives that would otherwise be thrown away, only to prolong the inevitable. A disappointing outcome, as Bulgaria can escape their awful decision-making consequence-free now. In October of 1857, Wallachia's Orthodox Church was ousted in favor of the Catholic Church, which would help keep them in Austria's grasp, surely, alongside beginning the effort to turn Romania into a proper Catholic stronghold. The same happened in Serbia in the same month, with mass conversions in Belgrade beginning right away. Just like with the Wallachians, Austria next targeted the Albanians in January of 1858, seeking to reduce their autonomy. Once again, the Bulgarians would show quite the courage in supporting Little Albania, which Austria would once again seek to punish. Unfortunately, Albania too backed down, leaving Bulgaria still free. Despite these unfortunate outcomes, not all of the empire's luck has withered away. The Bavarians fell into civil war the following year, and in return for support, the royalist Bavarian regime promised submission to Austria. That's a deal the emperor is happy to make. With no further intervention, the war between Bavaria and Austria ended quickly, with the new regime becoming an Austrian protectorate. By September of 1859, this is the Austrian market, by the way. Some of these are power bloc members, as I adopted the internal trade principle, and others are subjects. However, it is an immense market all the same. Getting all of Italy in the market is a huge boon, and assuming that they do unite, a union of Catholic interests between Italy and Austria should lead to immense prosperity and power. Peace is always nice for prosperity, it's true, but before peace can grip the empire, there are a few more wars that have to get done. First of all, the inevitable separation of the southern Serbs came about in February of 1863, which Austria would, of course, support. Although in hindsight, because the Ottomans have no ability to get to that front, the Serbs were guaranteed to win, regardless of Austrian intervention. The Serbs did win in August of 1864, seeing the two Serbias united under the Karađorđević puppet king. Another war to come would be the liberation of Schleswig and Holstein. This war was not actually of particular interest to the Austrians, who had not really taken on the mantle of German leadership for any reason other than to keep the Prussians out of it. The reason the Austrians have only now shown an interest in freeing the Germans under Denmark is because part of Bavaria, Austria's little puppet, is cut off from the market in the west, and that's kind of annoying. By freeing these German states, Austria can claim dominance over all of the South Germans. Thanks to Denmark's failure to make any friends in recent history, this war was simply a 1v1, and as a result, the war ended in November of 1865 with total Austrian victory. As a result, the South Germans joined the Austrian Empire willingly, with the exception of the Hohenzollerns, who remained loyal to Prussia. From here, the empire would see peace, for a little while. The Ottomans remain a threat in the east, but a much more distant and neutered threat than before. Meanwhile, the Italians are uniting, but remaining loyal to the Catholic mission of the Golden Fleece League. We can see the work of Austrian missionaries coming to fruition in some of the Balkans too. As of August of 1867, the plurality of people in western Thrace and central Bulgaria have become Catholic, and more converts are coming every day. Even the aforementioned government deficit has begun to clear up, with new industries producing enough taxable revenue to keep the government's books balanced. The debt will soon be paid off, and the people are gaining immense riches from the economic opportunities afforded to them by the ever-expanding American market. In January of 1869, we've completed the power block. The principles are divine economics, freedom of movement, market unification, and construction. They represent the religious principles of this Austrian Empire, focusing in on industry, missionary work, and unity above all. Before moving on to the promised time of peace, there's just one more war for Austria to start, and that's the final removal of Ottoman influence in the Balkans. Macedonia, Eastern Thrace, and Thessaly will be conquered, and as such the Turks will be evicted from Europe. The Ottoman Empire has long been in decline, and as a result their army was like paper against the now seasoned Austrian army. The Ottomans weren't even willing to fight particularly hard, as their economic status left them in fear of bankruptcy even before the war, let alone during it. The final blow to Ottoman presence in Europe was struck in May of 1870, and with it, Austria has freed the Balkans. Only Greece remains outside of Austrian influence. But that can be amended by peaceful means, surely, right? This is Austria in August of 1870. The era of Catholic hegemony has only just begun. The The Church has often in its history, through the divine right of kings, worked to uphold the power and rights of the monarchies of Europe. It was, after all, in their best interest to leave the expenses of governing to the monarchs while reaping the profits of the tithe all for themselves. And yet, with the entanglement of economics and government coming to the forefront of politics this 19th century we find ourselves in, the Church has taken an increasing role in the nation at more levels than just the actual houses of worship that dot the nation. A movement to demote the monarch to a position below that of the Church has gripped the nation, particularly after the Pope lost his secular power to Italian nationalists in the Risorgimento. An Austrian theocracy, guided by the righteous hand of the Church, became an idea that, although threatening the Habsburgs, would find so much support that its eventual enactment was an assured eventuality. The long-entrenched Habsburg family would not simply allow this, and royalists in Vienna rose up in May of 1871. They expected that the loyal peasants of the empire would come to their aid. However, it became increasingly clear that the disparate peoples of the empire were much happier to unify around their Catholic identity than their Habsburg identity. The industrial heart of Austria had long since moved to Hungary, and Mavag locomotives carried men-at-arms to Vienna, ready to put down the monarchists of old. In a blatant show of bravado, the Church considered these royalist upstarts to be so petty a problem that they started a war against Greece and the British Empire so as to prevent Greece proper and the Ionian Islands from further slipping into either British or Russian spheres of influence. The Russians were already honor-bound to support the Austrian government against the royalists, and so would not come to Greece's aid. The British, though, are certainly a menace to be concerned about. Although strictly untrue, rumors about British Habsburg collusion to overthrow the Church spread like wildfire in the empire, and the anti-monarchist fervor of especially the Hungarian peasants would see a near total revision of history in the Austrian world. The British are disgusting Protestants who make a mockery of the proper Catholic Christian way, and their collusion with the Habsburgs may have been hidden from history, but the truth is out now. Reconciliation is impossible. The war with the Royalists began in September of 1871, and the war in Greece began shortly after. The goal of the Greece War is to subjugate the Kingdom of Greece and the Ionian Islands, which are currently under British influence. While the Greek front was pretty simple, and the Royalist rebels of Vienna should have been, they were putting up a surprising fight. It was an early example of urban warfare, as the monarchist rebels held up in the various coffee houses of the city and laid traps throughout the place they called home, all to protect the royal palace from theocratic invaders. Thanks to aid from the Kingdom of Saxony, the Austrian rebels were even able to make headway into Prague and establish some royalist garrisons there. Despite that, the Austrian monarchists are without supply and their numbers are dwindling. Despite their seeming gains, their casualties are mounting, and their little control over Vienna is slowly disappearing. In other news, the Greeks surrendered in April of 1872, and the Ionians were quickly occupied, putting the ball into Britain's court. They'll have to find a way to regain control over Greece if they want to stop the Austrians from declaring victory. Their only hope is to use the Royal Navy for a swift landing, but the Austrian army is ready to defend its coasts. Shortly after, the circle of theocrats and cardinals running the interim government of Austria received a message from the emperor in Vienna. It seems the Habsburgs are willing to offer a compromise. The monarchy can go, but the emperor wishes to complete his divinely mandated rule as a figurehead king. Once he passes away, the empire will pass to the Church officially, and that can be the end of Habsburg rule in Austria. The terms were acceptable, and so the royalists stood down and accepted that this would be the last king they'll serve. The Austrian army was placed on the coasts of the nation, ready to defend against the British, who, if they were to make a landing, might fight to restore the monarchy in the eyes of the fervent Catholic Crusaders of Austria. Although at first the limited Austrian navy put up a valiant fight against the Royal Navy, it did lose, inevitably. As a result of that, the British were able to, via what we in the Victoria III business call BS, land in Istria. If there are enough naval landings all going at once, it's almost impossible to have the game successfully calculate that a general will be available for all of them, so despite my immense garrisons, Istria was occupied. That's fine, the valiant Austrian army can kick them back to the sea. Despite the British winning several battles, the casualties they're taking in doing so are wearing down their will to fight, and since Austria still occupies the Ionian Islands, the British are seemingly floundering about in Slovenia and Croatia, just wasting their time and getting killed. The war came to an end in February of 1873, with the Ionian Islands falling into Austrian hands. Now that is a beautiful market. Austria controls a vast market, most of which is Catholic and all of which will soon be proselytized. In order to pacify the Greeks and bring them closer to the empire, they were granted control over most of the Ottoman territories that Austria conquered earlier, creating a resurgent Greek nation. There's a dual purpose to this. The obvious one is that Greece will lose Liberty Desire, but the bigger one is that we can easily insert a group of Catholics in those states by later on converting Greece to Catholicism with our power block. It's always fun to mix roleplay and gameplay in one. In the chaos of the war with Britain and the previous civil war, news of Italian unification did reach the empire, although it was sidelined for more important issues. This is a big boon for the Austrians though, who have been able to secure Italian loyalty to the Catholic cause, creating a power block with two great powers in it. This alliance will surely lead to great things for the two nations, assuming Italian ambitions to control Venice never resurface. From this point, Austria enjoyed a genuine era of peace. Their ambitions have mostly been achieved, and now it's only a matter of time until the Catholic missionaries succeed in their work. Peace will never last forever, but from 1873 to 1877, Austria did enjoy peace. She found herself at war again though, when an opportunity too great to let go appeared. The Ottoman Empire, the dead man of Europe, is facing an Armenian rebellion, and in light of the threat to Christian lives there, the College of Austrian Cardinals decided that the Turks could not be allowed to simply exist across the straits. They must be convinced of the error of their Muslim ways and be brought under the wing of Christianity. For the low price of 47 infamy, the Austrians shall turn the Ottomans into a protectorate vassal state of the empire, and in due time, flood their lands with Catholic missionaries and turn the mosques into churches, so that the Turkish menace can be turned to a beacon of Christendom. As was already suspected, the Protestant North Germans under Prussia chose to backstab their German Christian brethren and support the Ottomans in their struggle against the faith. To even consider such a betrayal put the Prussians to the lowest levels of hell in the eyes of the Austrians, but it's not like their entry into the war will change anything. Even the treacherous Brits sided with the Ottomans, hoping to stop the rise of this supreme Austrian Empire. Neither the Prussians, nor Ottomans, nor British, even if combined, can stop the combined might of the Austrian and Russian armies. In light of the reality facing them, the Ottomans did back down and accepted their fate as an Austrian vassal. After all, maybe the Ottomans can benefit from access to the Austrian market, if anything, no matter how humiliating it may be. Shortly after their surrender, the Austrian missionaries reached Greece and got to work bringing the people under papal authority, and once their mission there is complete, they'll move on to the Ottoman Empire itself. Once the Ottomans have been Catholicized, the unified Muslim world will shatter even more so than it already has, and Europe need not worry about a Muslim incursion again. This is the true era of Austrian peace, and in a way, the peace of earlier was never really disturbed, since the Ottomans did back down before war could begin. The Righteous Austrian Crusade went from war to industry again, as the people refocused on creating a prosperous economy for all their Catholic brethren. Legislation to force businesses to sell at a lower price to Catholics would see conversions skyrocket, as incentives to convert to the proper faith were laid out. Surely, the supremacy of the faith alone should be enough to convince the people, but sometimes a little discount at the clothes store can be all the push a person needs to take the right step. In December of 1882, the Ottomans were finally ready to accept the faith, and so they are welcomed to the church alongside a sizable portion of their people. This is where I have to unfortunately let you know that there won't be a ton of conversion among the Turks, because they have freedom of conscience, and conversion only happens under that law if the pop's tolerance level is at 3 or below. I will try to change their law to state religion, but there isn't much support for it, and changing the law of your subject is famously fiddly. Regardless, much of the Ottoman Arab population is discriminated enough to convert, so we may see the rise of Catholicism at least in the outskirts of the empire, but most importantly, in Palestine. The Crusade is over, and now Austria will rule benevolently. That is, unless anyone else in Europe chooses to provoke her wrath. The wars of religion in the Balkans are over. Now it's time to show the supremacy of Catholic worth ethic and industry. The entire region is full of resources, and the various companies of Austria under the guidance of the Church will convert those resources into wonderful amenities for the people. As of November of 1884, the Austrian Empire enjoys a relatively high standard of living for its 90 million people, but it still stands as the number 2 great power. The British have a great deal of influence in the world, and to dethrone them will not be easy. GDP-wise, the Austrian bloc is not far behind the British Empire, but it is certainly impressive how the combined economies of Italy, Austria, and the Ottomans cannot topple the British Empire's dominant economic status. The motivation to work for money is a powerful one, and it is the driving force of the British Empire, but the Austrian workers are giving everything they have to work for the glory of God, imbuing them with power beyond any material motivation. Despite Austria's relatively unindustrialized origin, the GDP has soared to £200 million by 1887 and only shows signs of continued acceleration. The competence and faith on display in the empire has led to an interesting decision by the cardinals. The time has come to return control of the nation to the people, to at least some extent. The reason behind the Catholic technocracy early on was to guide the misguided people of the empire towards something greater. But now that they have indeed found God and asserted their faith, they have the right to organize themselves how they see fit. If all goes well, creating a democratic constitution by which the Austrian government can further legitimize itself will actually see power further concentrated to the church maybe. The people should vote for the continued dominance of the Catholic Church, if only because they themselves are all Catholic. Giving people a choice is wonderful when the choice they make is the one you want them to make. The bill to pass into suffrage was supported by few in government, but nonetheless would see a slow gain in momentum over time. The Catholic missionaries of the empire have done many miracles across the Balkans, and thanks to the economic incentives to convert, alongside the spiritual supremacy of the faith, nearly the entirety of the Balkans has been converted, with only Istanbul and, strangely, southern Serbia holding out by April of 1891. This is because when southern Serbia joined Serbia via a revolt earlier, I had already converted Serbia's faith, meaning we have not planted a Catholic seed there in southern Serbia. No matter, we just need one Catholic pop to eventually migrate there, and then they'll convert too. It might take a while, but it should eventually happen. A few months afterwards, the right to vote was implemented across the empire, as an Austrian constitution was written up and enforced across the land. The people prepared to cast their ballots, and the polls were looking good for the Catholic Church. The party with the most votes was certainly the Catholic Party, but surprisingly close behind were the progressives. It was quite amazing actually how the voting patterns of the people could be nearly perfectly segmented into 4 quarters, with a slight edge for the Catholic Party. Regardless, whether they win by a landslide or just barely, a win is a win. Unfortunately, despite their seeming dominance at first, momentum would swing to the progressives, who barely won the election with just 24% of the vote. What was surprising was that the shrewd political minds of the Progressive Party understood the value and importance of the Catholic Church to the Austrian identity, and so chose not to try and dissolve any of the immense privileges and powers of the Church. They instead accepted them and focused in on other issues like the economy. In particular, a campaign to light up the empire was the primary issue for the progressives, who wanted to see Austria become the most enlightened place, in a very literal sense, of Europe. I always hate playing with electricity in this game because it's a huge pain to manage, but with an empire like this, it's a little easier to actually put power plants in every state. These power plants will be powered with Mavag engines, an ever-present symbol of the importance of Hungary to the empire. Returning to the campaign of enlightenment, the Progressive Party got to work creating a proper primary school curriculum so that the youth of the nation could acquire a proper education and stop working dead-end jobs in the mines for little pay. So long as the schools are still run by the church, there will be no opposition to this idea from them. The GDP hit £300 million in 1896, by the way, and Austria has achieved that mostly by focusing on a growing consumer economy. With electricity comes access to better and better production methods for making clothes, alongside more demand for engines. Mavag locomotives and engines are able to employ millions of peasants across the Carpathian Plains, and using that income, the workers are able to buy clothes produced by the electric sewing machines which the engines they made are powering. It's an infinite loop of work and consumption that sees the standard of living and economic output of the empire spiral upwards. The GDP would jump again at £350 million in September of the next year, when Austria went to war with Prussia to take over Hohenzollern. Peacetime may soon be upon Austria by this point, but this war is too small to really buckle the nation how previous wars did. Instead, this war is a mere fixing of the borders, a skirmish at most really. During the Prussian skirmish, a new political movement gained some traction in the nation, namely the positivist movement, which in terms of its real beliefs is quite the threat to the church, given it asserts that knowledge and truth, and therefore law, are derived from reason, logic, experience, and other ungodly things. Obviously, the legal nature of this empire is based on the natural laws of the Bible and of God, and moral law and things like that. The thing is, in the game, positivism is kind of just a bonus to literacy, since the positivists don't really agitate for anything. This is more of a problem with the way the game's political movements in general work, as they just don't really do much to you if you upset them, unless you really harshly upset them, such as banning slavery with a slavery movement in the United States. That means that I'm actually going to encourage the positivist movement for the free education access, despite the fact that this movement is anathema to my nation. Anyway, the Prussian War ended pretty fast, with Hohenzollern being incorporated into the empire, and then the military took a short break, followed by a war against the Ottomans to reduce their autonomy. Despite having accepted Christendom, the Ottomans remained too distant from the empire and continued to maintain a large Muslim population. In order to convert that population, the Austrians must turn the Sultan into a puppet and lay the groundwork for an Anatolian Inquisition. I say that, but getting the Ottomans to pass state religion is almost impossible with their current interest-group composition. The war erupted shortly before the turn of the century, and this January of 1900 would be an important point for Austria. The GDP is on the cusp of £400 million. There's a new election with a massive Catholic party composed of the church and the trade unions, and the war with the Ottomans goes on without much fanfare. This is also the moment at which Austria became the #1 great power in the world. Austrian hegemony over Europe is more or less guaranteed, although nations like France and Spain operate outside of Austrian influence for the most part. As far as the League of the Golden Fleece is concerned though, these are Catholic nations, and so their destruction is simply unnecessary. Regardless, the Ottomans did surrender their autonomy in May of 1900, and now Austria faces a fork in the road. Does she continue on building up the industrial heart of the nation and watching the faith spread, or does she become a more proactive member on the world stage to truly unseat the British and French? There's a divide in the empire with regards to the fate of the French. They are Catholics, sure, but the French have often in their recent history been shaky in the dedication to the Lord. The recent rise of positivism itself, a brainchild of a Frenchman, Auguste Comte, is evidence of the lacking French faith, and as such it would only be righteous to dismantle the French state. It was with the invention of the Zeppelin that the Austrian army realized it has a rare, powerful advantage over the French army right now that must be pounced on. When you research Zeppelins, you get this event, up in the air. One of the options for it is to get a flat plus 30 offense bonus. So that's completely ridiculously overpowered, but it only lasts for 2 years. Well, the event lasts 90 days, the modifier lasts 2 years. So how about we start the war now and then click the event and use the 2 years of bonus offense to absolutely slaughter the French army. Looking at the war preview here, it looks like it will be quite the war, but I'm telling you, with this bonus 30 offense, I am invincible. The goal here is to liberate Occitania, to mold it into a proper Catholic nation, and to take Alsace-Lorraine, which is rightful German territory anyway. Alongside that, we'll be liberating Algeria, so we can turn them into a Catholic nation as well. To help win this war, I'll be calling in Italy and Russia, and the French are calling on Iberia. That means 5 great powers are involved in this war, and I'd honestly assert this is more or less a World War I analog. Unfortunately, because Victoria III has no way to simulate the size of a world war, most of the maneuvers in this war have been spent on just inviting the allies to the war, let alone assigning war goals. That means that 5 great powers are fighting over a relatively small set of war goals. Anyway, check out these battles. With my huge offense bonus, I can easily land in northern France with 1 army while pushing through Savoy with another one, and the French army just melts before the power of Austrian Zeppelins. These Zeppelins, given their ability to drop explosives from the sky, but only for 2 years, became an important symbol for the Austrian army. Like God sending destruction from the skies, these Zeppelins fly above the fray and lay waste to all heretics and heathens below them. Or in this case, all the Frenchmen below them. Although the Iberians have always been, historically, dedicated to Catholics, their choice to support the French was evidence that they had lost their way, so even the Iberians were not spared the wrath of God's Zeppelins. Paris was occupied just after Christmas in 1901, but credit where it's due, the French would not surrender easily. They kept fighting as far as May, at which point nearly the entire nation was under Austrian occupation. The war finally came to an end in June, with total Austrian victory resulting in the liberation of Occitania and Algeria, alongside the annexation of both Corsica and Alsace-Lorraine. Immediately, envoys from the League of the Golden Fleece got to work establishing ties with the newly released nations from France, and at this point, Austria's League of Catholics, plus Russia, is seemingly unstoppable. In June of 1903, the GDP hit £515 million, and the standard of living finally crossed the 20-point threshold, creating what can only be described as heaven on earth, at least for the Catholics. By stacking all these wage modifiers for state religion pops, we've really created a stratified society with more than 50% higher wages for Catholic pops than anyone else. There's only one issue remaining for the nation: rubber. But right now, Austria depends entirely on rubber imports from Britain, and that works fine considering the relatively low demand for rubber in the market, but in the future, things may change, especially given the Austro-British diplomatic situation and its relatively tense history. After all, the mythos of the Austrian theocracy holds that the British plotted with the Habsburgs to maintain the monarchy, and that is an affront to Christendom. Regardless, the main priority for the empire right now is to fix the deficit, as usual. Sometimes I get overzealous with how high my construction can go and end up having a £3 million deficit while nearing the debt cap. It happens. To fix this, all I have to do is raise taxes 2 steps, which will have an unfortunately deflationary impact on the GDP and standard of living because I've tied most of my economy to consumer goods. If pops are taxed more, they can't buy as much stuff, and when they can't buy as much stuff, the profits on their industries go down. With fewer profits come lower wages, and with lower wages comes less consumption, repeating the cycle downwards until equilibrium is reached. Sometimes this can be pretty disastrous, since a shrinking GDP also shrinks your debt cap, but also it's sometimes the only real answer to the problem. The GDP dropped as low as £480 million in December of 1906, down from about £550 million that it was at when I raised the taxes, and the SOL dropped to 19. It's a heavy hit, but one that we can take. With enough time, the GDP did recover back to $550 million in March of 1909, but the SOL struggled to climb. At least the debt is about a quarter paid off though. We'll surge back to the #1 great power and we'll get the SOL back up in no time. Here's a look at the market in October of 1909. The white part in Egypt is actually the French market, by the way, they just have no market access, but Algeria and Occitania are indeed in the power block. Bonus, we also got Ireland, which is a great Catholic stronghold. As expected, we're short on rubber. Despite importing over 6,500 units of rubber, we just can't get enough of it off the British, who are refusing to build it up in Africa. A time may soon come to seize Africa from the Protestant heretics to properly make use of the resources there, but a war does not feel wise while the nation is recovering from tax hikes. It was unfortunate then that the British forced an Austrian response when they issued a formal embargo in November of 1909. Regardless of the embargo, by the way, I would have had to go to war because I was actually importing the maximum allowed number of units of rubber from Britain, since I hit level 100 on the trade route, and trade routes don't go beyond level 100. I was using over 7,000 convoys to carry 5,000 units of rubber. How does that make any sense? Less than 1 unit of rubber was on each ship. Please. I hope the trade changes coming in June make trade actually good. I'm begging you. Anyway, it's time to invade Africa and seize the means of using rubber production methods. The war began in August of 1910. The goal is to seize all British colonies in Africa, and I'm hyping this war up, but it's pretty easy given how powerful I am by this point. I have an army in the Congo fighting in the jungles, I've got another army going for a landing in Kenya, and another army trying to land in London. Since all my war goals are in Africa, I don't even need to actually land in London to win this war, but it might make it end faster. Nonetheless, my AI ally Russia managed to land in the West Country all by themselves. Well done, Russia. That is honestly pretty impressive. I'm still mostly focused on the fronts in Africa though. Seeing that they had no chance, the British did surrender in October of 1911, and now all that Congolese rubber belongs to Austria. The rubber price remains high and shall be brought down over time. However, these African colonies find themselves in the unfortunate position of being Protestant. We will soon fix that. As part of the rise of total Catholic dominance on the world stage, the Catholic Church looked to its previous constitution, which allowed for democracy in the nation. Well, democracy is nice, but the people keep on picking other parties, and that's just kind of annoying. No, it's about time for the people to cast their last votes. It's time for the single-party state, and work on this movement had begun during the British War, but came to the forefront of politics in 1912 around March. It was controversial, and it wouldn't be too easy to pass, but it certainly can be passed in good time. The Church made the argument that the other parties in the election are more or less just dilutions of the Austrian theocracy's Catholic interests. After all, every party wants to see the Church strengthened, or else, and every party wants to see the empire strengthened, right? So why bother splintering the will of the people to squabble over nothing? The law gained popularity as the Austrian GDP and SOL continued to rise thanks to the new source of resources in the Congo, which could feed the beast of industry back home. The single-party state under the Catholic Party of Austria came to be in February of 1914. The truth is that Austria had effectively been a single-party state for a long time, but now it's official is all that's changed. Oh, by the way, since I haven't been showing a whole lot of businesses and their huge profits this run, check out this Mavag-owned motor industry in Bohemia. Now that we have rubber, we can make cars. The people, they love to buy cars. Mavag is famous for making trains, and I don't think they really made any cars, but I'd like to imagine that Mavag cars would kind of look like the trains. I don't know. From what I've googled, Hungary, quite notably, doesn't have much of a domestic car industry, instead producing cars for foreign companies like Audi. They did produce some heavy-duty trucks and buses during the Soviet era. Between the world wars, they did a little bit of car making. When I say a little bit, I mean a little bit. They made, according to Wikipedia, a total of 2,000 passenger cars, 150 trucks and buses, and 1,000 automobile engines, if we even count those. Well, in this world, Mavag, the train company, has diversified into cars. Very cool. Around this time, I started to wind down the playthrough. My goal was to convert the Balkans to Catholicism. We have easily achieved that, and more. We even converted Hejaz, Baghdad, Basra, and some of Syria to Catholicism. I hit $1 billion GDP in the mid-1910s or so, and then wanted to inflate my stats as much as possible, so I just dropped all my taxes and let the economy run in an untenable state. I'm intentionally throwing the game to inflate my stats to see how high I can go, only because I don't intend to continue. I started defaulting in December of 1920 and stopped the run there. My GDP ended up deflating below $1 billion because I stopped constructing, but hey, check out that standard of living. That's not bad. By this point in the game, my new golden goose was the oil industry in Poland and Ukraine, but I wasn't even that interested in that stuff. I looked over the League of the Golden Fleece with pride. We've converted so much land and brought about a prosperous Catholic world using, well, war. There's not really a way to do much in Victoria 3 without war, so I'd say we did something unique here, but really, it's just like any other Victoria 3 game, except I used a religious block to accelerate conversion. Looking around the culture map, we see some interesting occurrences. Britain conquered a ton of China, which results in some crazy migration to Britain itself. Chinese pluralities in Lancashire, Wales, and the West Country certainly look funny, but even in the English plurality states, there are tons of immigrants. My country is pretty normal looking, since I didn't do a whole lot of crazy migration. I focused almost entirely on religious conversion. The SOL map looks funny because of the sea of green in the middle of Europe, although it's fair to call this unfair because it's an inflated number caused by eradicating taxes in an unmaintainable way. The more reasonable SOL number for this nation would be something like 23 or 23.5 maybe. Anyway, this has been the Austrian theocracy GIGACHAD story. There aren't a ton of opportunities for true creativity in Victoria 3, but I'm proud of what we pulled off here, and I hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you for your time.